From Channel 6, this is Action News, Issues and Answers, a weekly interview program with the Delaware Valley's most talked about newsmaker. Now here's Jim Gardner.
Good morning and welcome to our program. The New Hampshire primary is over, and what did it tell us? Well, it told us that Tsongas wins, Clinton still survives, Harkin and Kerry try to fight it out and survive between each other perhaps, Jerry Brown still hanging around, Mario Cuomo perhaps encouraging a write-in while he's saying that he is not encouraging it, and perhaps Richard Gephardt and Albert Gore sitting around wishing they hadn't overestimated the strength of President Bush. I don't know, maybe that's a scenario. On the Republican side, Pat Buchanan doesn't win, but scares the heck out of George Bush and has prompted him to take a different kind of approach as he campaigns for re-election. We have in our studios today one of the two of the best-known political consultants in the city of Philadelphia, Neil Oxman, on the Democratic side, and it's always a pleasure to have Mr. Oxman in our studios. And to his left, geographically speaking, here in the studio, Shanin Specter, who is a well-known Republican consultant, and our senior correspondent Mark Howard joins us today.
Shanin, I think the first question is it possible, as some people are saying, that Stephen Friend in Pennsylvania might do to Shanin Specter what Pat Buchanan did to George Bush, and that is to send a wake-up call, and who knows, maybe even win the primary. Do you see any parallel here?
Well, Mark, if my father wins the primary by 16 points, he'll be very happy indeed. I think, of course, there was a wake-up call to George Bush through Pat Buchanan, and perhaps even before that in November here in Pennsylvania with Harris Wofford's victory. But I think you have to look at the reality of the election. You said it correctly. Pat Buchanan sent a wake-up call. He is a messenger. But I don't think he is a serious threat to beat George Bush in the primaries. I doubt he will win a single primary. What it means in terms of dissatisfaction with the course of the country's economy, of course, is a different matter. And there I think the president has to continue to address that problem.
Neil, do you think Senator Specter should be worried?
Yeah, I think the difference between Shanin Specter and Dick Thornburgh is that ever since 1973, when Arlen lost his re-election to District Attorney of Philadelphia, I don't think you need to prod him or have him worry about elections. I think that Arlen will beat Stephen Friend in the primary. I think he's going to have a very tough general election. I mean, I think that Pennsylvania is a Democratic state. There are almost 400,000 more Democrats in Pennsylvania than Republicans. In 1988, Mike Dukakis ran the worst campaign in the world in Pennsylvania, only lost by 100,000 votes. When Democrats decide to vote Democratic in Pennsylvania, it's tough for Republicans. And I think that regardless of the good campaign I'm sure Shanin Specter will run in '92 compared to the bad campaign Dick Thornburgh ran in '91, if Democrats decide this fall to walk into the booth, click one lever and walk out, a Republican statewide on the ballot is in trouble.
But that's only happened once now in some, in many years since you say when Democrats decide to vote like Democrats, but
exactly.
that doesn't usually happen.
Sure. It happened in '64, Lyndon Johnson landslide. It happened in '74, post-Watergate. It happened in '82, recession. They're the three best Democratic years since 1960. Arguably, now the election is 36 weeks from Tuesday. Arguably, if the economy doesn't get much better, especially in Pennsylvania, if you continue to have a division in the country and the recession is as bad as it's been for a year now, '92 could be as good a Democratic year as '82 was, as '74, as '64, when lots of Democrats swept House seats and Senate seats.
The problem with Neil's analysis, Jim, is that he forgets some important historical facts. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson carried the state by 1 million votes, but the Republican Senator, Hugh Scott, hung on and won because people split tickets. In '74, which is Neil's second example, Milton Schaap won the governorship. It's true, but Dick Schweiker won the Senate seat as a Republican. In 1982, also a tough year for Republicans, Dick Thornburgh hung on barely against Alan Erdel, and John Hines won in a landslide for the Senate. Pennsylvania has a history of splitting tickets. Pennsylvanians look very closely at both a Senate race or governor's race and the presidency. And I think that they'll look closely again this year. I think we should also note that Neil is working for one of the potential Democratic Senate candidates, so he may have a bit of a bias built into his analysis.
Oh, like Shanin doesn't. we all know. Like Shanin isn't biased.
We all know that I do, but some people may not know that Neil may.
Well, one's a Republican, one's a Democrat. Any chance that the Pennsylvania primary could, for the first time in a long time, have a real impact on the presidential situation?
It is, but you know, somebody asked me that the other day, and then I went to my election calendar. Between today, which is the South Dakota, which is the main caucuses, and Pennsylvania, there are 37 primaries and caucuses, 37. Pennsylvania is very late in the calendar. What makes Pennsylvania unique is that there's nothing major within the 2 weeks before it. Mm-hmm. If we continue to have a muddled situation, Pennsylvania might be as definitive as it was in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was able to finally beat Scoop Jackson and Mo Udall by big enough. But, you know, with 37 primaries and caucuses before Pennsylvania, who knows?
Are you as sure as you can be? Let's just give 1 second of background here. Nothing I do takes a second. Paul Tsongas wins in New Hampshire, but of course his problem is that a territorial victory, and can he do anything once he gets out of the Massachusetts area? Bill Clinton does better than perhaps some thought he might 2 weeks before the primary, finishes a strong second, and now he gets to go into some areas that would be more conducive to him. Okay, but still murky, as you put it. Right. Are you as sure as you can be that the Democratic nominee for president is among those candidates who are now running in the primary?
I think the Democratic nominee is for one reason, and that is that as of today, if anybody were to announce, they'd be shut out of about 72 or 73% of all the delegates. Now, that's not to say we couldn't have a brokered convention. There hasn't been a brokered convention in a long time. But because if you announce your candidacy for president on the Democratic side, you could not qualify to win almost 3/4 of the Democratic delegate votes. On the first ballot at the convention in New York, you'd be shut out. I mean, I think it's highly
And is it
unlikely.
fantasy to think that the leadership of the Democratic Party is looking at the situation and saying, we got the C team in here, or the B team at best, you know, we kind of blew it. Can we conspire, and that's sort of a loaded word, I don't mean it to be, can we conspire to broker this convention, make sure that nobody wins on the first ballot, and try to get Mario or Mr. Gephardt or Mr. Gore or Senator Benson? Is that fantasy, or is that
no? It's not.
Or is Ron Brown mulling over the logistics of doing something?
I think that there are people in Washington thinking about it for one reason. There are these 700 super delegates around who aren't particularly pledged to anybody. But if Bill Clinton does fairly well on Super Tuesday, wins in Texas where he's winning big, wins in Florida where he's winning big, does fairly well throughout the rest of the South, he might gather enough momentum to make that, you know, less of a possibility. You know, Dick Gephardt, according to everything I've read, was very, very ready to jump into the race this past week. When Clinton rebounded to 26% of the vote, he stopped. Cuomo, you know, is going to play Hamlet for the rest of his life, probably. Gore is not really looking at it. I mean, I did Al Gore's presidential campaign in '88, and he's not looked at it very seriously. I think that more than likely the nominee will emerge from these 5 men.
And you think it'll be?
I think Clinton's the favorite.
Yeah.
I think he's the favorite.
A year ago, Shanin, I think the conventional wisdom among Democrats and Republicans, of course, but Democrats was that you can't beat an incumbent president like George Bush, especially things are looking good, the Russians are disappearing, things are okay, the economy's chugging along. Are you as confident today as you were a year ago that he's totally unbeatable and this whole exercise is just an exercise?
Well, I wasn't confident a year ago that the president was unbeatable, and I'm not confident today that he's unbeatable either. I think that the reality is that people's views on the president are shaped largely by their views about the economy. And the economy is in lousy shape right now, so there's a lot of unhappiness toward the president. But what we're confronting today, Mark, is a circumstance where people are looking at the president and they're comparing him to their mythical idea of the perfect president. And they're saying that he doesn't measure up in their minds, and so they're expressing unhappiness by voting for, in this case, Pat Buchanan in some substantial numbers in New Hampshire. What's going to happen in October and November as we reach the end of this race is that people are going to have to make a choice between a then identifiable and specific Democrat, and I agree with Neil that that person will likely come from the field that is currently in there, that person versus George Bush. At that point in time, the president will have an opportunity to compare and contrast his record and what he would do for the country to someone else, as will that person have a chance to compare their record with the president's. When the voters are confronted with that kind of a choice, it's a very different analysis than the choice between George Bush and the mythical perfect president. I think at that point in time, the president will have a much better chance to convince voters that they should, in fact, re-elect him. Until he can identify that person, he's got a much tougher time.
That sounds like a left-handed compliment in that you seem to be saying that George Bush is not Ronald Reagan, in that he doesn't really have a constituency that's really for him. But when it comes down to two choices, they may pick the lesser of two evils.
Well, no, I'm not really saying that. President Reagan had pretty poor poll numbers in 1982 when we had a deep recession. President Reagan, fortunate for him, did not have to face the electorate in 1982. If he did, he might not have been reelected president. When he faced the electorate for re-election in '84, the economy was in much better shape, so that he was able to enjoy the public approval for his handling of the economy, and therefore people didn't compare him against some concept of a president that would do a better job with the economy. For example, right now we're going to be looking carefully, I think all of us, at the economic blueprints of Governor Clinton, of Senator Tsongas. I heard on television this week criticism of Senator Tsongas by some of Governor Clinton's supporters in specific, his ideas on the economy. As people begin to consider those things in specific, there'll be a whittling away of that mythical concept.
Are Bill Clinton's personal problems over as far as this campaign is concerned?
I think they are. I think that if there are no new revelations that you know, some people will say, okay, because he allegedly had an affair and had some question about his draft situation, they're not going to vote for him. But remember, Jim, presidential campaigns are decided by the Electoral College and by individual states. And to answer Mark's question, what I think makes this race interesting is the arithmetic of 1988. Mike Dukakis wins 10 states in the District of Columbia and 112 electoral votes. If you give him those 10 states and the District of Columbia, and you add 3 more states, Pennsylvania where he lost 51-49, Ohio where he lost 51-49, and California where he lost 52-48. You're talking about the Democratic nominee, Bill Clinton or Paul Tsongas or somebody else, having 225 electoral votes almost. You only need 270 to win. And I think that Bill Clinton's problems would not prevent him necessarily from winning those 3 states, which, as Shanin said, people care about the economy. If 36 weeks from today, the nominees are George Bush and Bill Clinton, and the economy is as bad or almost as bad as today, this will be an incredibly close election, and I think the Democrat has a chance.
I remember not long ago when the networks were reporting their polls shortly after this alleged adultery thing came up and Clinton appeared on 60 Minutes and all of that. The commentators were saying, you know, apparently the public doesn't think this is such a big deal after all, because 8 out of 10 voters say that this thing doesn't bother them. And perhaps we've made too much of this. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, am I hearing the same thing that he's saying? If you lose 20%, and I'm not suggesting that those telephone polls are accurate, but if you lose 20% of your potential voters because of one issue where they can no longer morally justify casting their lot with you, you can't win, can you? Well, I mean, a landslide is 55-45. If you're talking about 20%
right,
that automatically discount you no matter how good a candidate you may be, that's devastating.
What happens disproportionately, though, if those 20% are fundamental conservative Republicans? You know, I mean, if in a sense the base of those people are voters that you're never going to get because they're going to go in, pull the Republican leader, vote for George Bush's reelection. I mean, I think that, yes, if the economy is not an issue, and we're at peace in the world, and there's only 6% unemployment in the country instead of 7%, and we have a lot of disposable income and a 4% growth per quarter, then those extraneous issues become important. But if the economy is bad, I think for most people, Bill Clinton's peccadillos are going to be less important. I think the economy will be key.
We'll continue our conversation about the whole presidential scenario in just a moment.
The WPVI-TV Minority Advisory Board celebrates the history of African Americans. The women who shared their talent and knowledge in our classrooms are part of that history. Patricia Robert Harris became Dean of Howard University's Law School. Fannie Jackson Copin, a scholar, became principal of the Cheney Training School for Teachers. And Charlotte Fortin Grimke dedicated her life to ending illiteracy.
This message has been brought to you by Bob's Big Boy Restaurant, home of all-you-can-eat breakfast bar.
A little loud back here, sir. Oh, careful.
What's the occasion?
Who knows? Right this way.
Just a minute, Jack. That's nice work. Sure.
We're gonna be late, sir. Hey, about that new dental plan.
You mean Delta Dental?
Yeah, Delta Dental. They don't hassle you. They make it easy.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Group insurance from Delta Dental.
Thanks.
We make it easy to smile.
Why has Bill Clinton apparently survived this issue when it struck down Gary Hart in an instant?
Because Gary Hart challenged people, because the press followed him, because they had much more evidence of his situation with Donna Rice. And Bill Clinton didn't ask for it. I mean, he owned up to the fact that there was trouble in his marriage. And he fought back. I mean, I think one of the great things about Bill Clinton is that he fought back so well. The USA CNN Gallup poll, the Friday before the election in New Hampshire, had that race at 40-20. Ended up being, 35-26. I mean, he came from essentially 20 points back to 9 or 10 back, and I think he's done a good job of doing it.
Is there also a first one in phenomenon at work here? When it happens a second time, the public tends not to be quite so.
Yeah,
so
I mean, and there's her credibility, and there's, I mean, look, I think if 5 more, or 2 more, or 1 more of these things happens, Bill Clinton, it will be very difficult for him to survive it. And I think that clearly it's hurt him. But if he can keep this race focused, and all of his Democratic opponents say they're not going to talk about it. Paul Tsongas and none of these folks talk about it, and it becomes less of an issue. Bill Clinton can define himself in the way he wants to define himself, not the way the media or the National Star or the National Globe wants to define
I think there's something else going on here also. And that is, I think that people are just sick and tired of having their electoral choices made for them by issues that are collateral or entirely irrelevant to governance. Bill Clinton has a lot of positive attributes. A lot of people in New Hampshire were impressed by him, and they just were not going to let these kinds of charges get in the way of their making a judgment about whether he was the best person to be the Democratic nominee and perhaps to be the President of the United States. Your comment, Jim, about Hart being the first in, I think may really have a lot of merit. It was one thing to get rid of a Gary Hart several years ago, 4 years ago. But people saw that act had consequences, and the consequence was that it denied the Democratic Party consideration of a person in Gary Hart who really had some ideas. They just weren't going to do it this time, especially considering the tough times we're in, and people are really searching for leadership. They're really searching for people with ideas. So I think that Clinton has survived, in part, as Neil says, because he's handled himself very well, but also because people are just tired of having their decisions made for them by others on irrelevant considerations.
Personally, I've been more impressed by the arguments about the Vietnam War and the draft registration than the marriage problem. And I remember back in 1972 when Americans had a choice clearly yes, no on the war, and Nixon trounced McGovern, who may have had a lot of other problems, but the war, clearly, America's a hawkish country. And is that going to, how do you think that will play to have a president who was shot down in World War II versus a candidate who figured out a way to avoid going to Vietnam?
Well, I think that it's a factor, but how substantial a factor is very questionable. Number one, a lot of people in this country feel that you were entitled to try to avoid the war in whatever way was lawful. I'm not sure I agree with that, but then again, I wasn't old enough to be called upon at that time, and it's hard to put yourself in that position unless you were of draft age at that time. I think it's probably unfair for those of us who weren't at that time of draft age to judge Bill Clinton. Also, that issue clearly is 23 years old, and people are going to have to make judgments about Bill Clinton today. There are some things about that concern me, But I think most people discount it very heavily because here again, they don't want to deny the process, the input that Bill Clinton gives it.
You sound very generous, but you know for sure that George Bush is going to try to dramatize the difference between his experience in World War II and Bill Clinton's experience in 1972, whenever it was. It's going to be a political issue that President Bush is going to try to take great advantage of.
I'm not sure that's true, Jim. I'm not sure that he will. It may be that the voters would reject that they would feel that we ought to be talking about the issues that are affecting this country this year and not about what happened in 1969.
You don't think that George Bush will try to emphasize family values to the greatest degree possible, to try to subtly infer that the family value component as it pertains to Bill Clinton may be suspect?
Well,
if you were running George Bush's campaign, wouldn't you do that?
Didn't work in
Huh?
If it were part of a mosaic of other issues that you could communicate fairly, that would be one thing. But by itself, no, I don't.
I'm not suggesting that should be the only component in George Bush's campaign. But as a mosaic, as you put it, it certainly will be something that the Republicans try to take advantage of, wouldn't you say?
Perhaps as a factor, but not as a major factor. And if they do, they're taking great risk that people are going to reject it because of the enormity of our current problems.
But on the other hand, Neil, Vice President Quayle, who I guess at worst, pulled a string to get into the National Guard, but yet he served, got all kinds of flack. And he's a darling of the conservatives who would ordinarily be outraged at somebody who tried to avoid the draft. Do you think that
Well, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think Bush will run the kind of tough, hard, negative campaign he has to run to win, which he didn't do in New Hampshire, interestingly, and he ended up with only 53% of the vote. If the economy is the major issue, and George Bush talks about things that are not economic related, you know, this Persian War, or whatever this thing was called, that people have forgotten about right now. You know, Bill Clinton's status with the draft, Jennifer Flowers. If he does that, it's not going to work. It's at least not going to work in perhaps 25 states that a Democrat needs to win. If, indeed, the economy is better in 36 weeks, and then other things can get factored in, then perhaps those kinds of spots will work. I mean, he did in you remember, as part of his commercials in 1988 was actually the footage of his being picked up, you know, after he was shot down, and then they did negative ads of Mike Dukakis in the tank, which were some of the most terrific ads that I've ever seen. You know, and it worked, but the economy wasn't in the state in '88 that it is in now.
You're saying that just overrides everything. Well, moving on to some local races, a couple of minutes left. Lou Blackwell, Congressman, West Philadelphia, replaced Bill Gray, facing a primary, perhaps Chaka Fattah. How do you assess that?
I think that if Chaka gets him one-on-one, and the district is a district that somebody like Chaka has a chance, he could upset him.
Now, you're suggesting there that it includes a part of the suburbs, perhaps?
Well, no, not necessarily. It could include the 8th Ward in Philadelphia, perhaps, which is Center City, Philadelphia,
it already
does. Broad Street. Well, I mean, it continues to. What Blackwell's trying to do in the legislature is has a district that doesn't include any of those places and is really his territory. But, you know, Lou only got elected with 39% of the vote. It was a three-way fight. And if you sort of count John White and Chaka Fattah as more of the same profile as Lou Blackwell on the other hand, I think that if it's a one-on-one situation, that it's going to be a very interesting primary. And Chaka is one of the hardest working politicians in Philadelphia.
Is Commissioner Fox the next Larry Coughlin up in Montgomery County?
Jim, I don't know. That's a good question. Congressman Coughlin only announced his retirement on Thursday.
Well, that should be more than enough time for you, Shane.
I was with Commissioner Fox on Thursday night, barely
plotting strategy,
barely 6 hours after the retirement was announced, and people were already calling him congressman. So, as you say, that has a way of occurring pretty rapidly. I'm not sure what's going to happen. There are a lot of very capable people in that congressional district, and if Commissioner Fox were to seek the nomination, he might have some primary competition or some strong competition in the general election. Part of the problem, of course, in that whole analysis is when are we going to know what the lines are? You know, you have to have a process. You have to have nominating petitions. You have to have a period for withdrawal, for challenges, and we only have 9 weeks and 2 days until the primary. So these things have to occur. The mechanics have to occur before we really know who the candidate is going to be.
Does Lou Blackwell have a point that it's not fair to take a district which is largely urban, lower income, largely black, and add to it, let's say, half of Lower Merion Township, which is upscale, wealthy, that he can't really fairly represent them both well?
Well, I think he has a point, although I think it's, you know, he's making that point from a self-interest point of view. I think that the question the court is going to decide, since the legislature has ducked the problem, is the Voting Rights Act. What's really going on is that some people in Harrisburg are trying to carve out 2 minority districts for Philadelphia, even though the city only has a 42% minority population. And I think that what Lou is really trying to avoid, Mark, is a district where, in a Democratic primary, people would be less likely to vote for him. And he assumes that if Shaka Fatah or John White ran against him in the Democratic primary, he would do less well in Lower Merion than he would in the 32nd Ward in North Philadelphia.
And raising money as well. Hardy Williams, the senator, state senator, may run against Tom Folletta, they say?
Would never beat him.
Won't have?
No.
Will he run?
Tom Folletta has had, in the 1980s, the toughest races year after year. He wins as an independent in 1980. He beats Joe Smith, who's a sitting congressman in 82 in a primary, has a race against, I think, a friend of yours. His name was Marino in the fall of 82. Beats Jimmy Tyoon in 84, beats Jimmy Tyoon in 86. Hardy Williams will not beat Tom Folletta in 1992.
That would depend in part, of course, on the district. If it includes the city of Chester, which there's talk that it may, it's possible.
This may sound harsh. You two guys are experts in politics, not necessarily governance.
It is
at least you get paid. You get paid.
As I say, that's what I always say.
I don't get paid, Jim. I'm not a consultant.
Okay. Here's my question. From a political standpoint, Ed Rendell, is he off to a good start? Mediocre? Bad? What's your feeling?
Well, I mean, obviously I'm biased. I think that this past week's issue about the 5-year plan, quote, was the first defining moment of the Rendell administration, and I think he's done very well.
And you think that went well?
Absolutely.
Shanin?
Jim, I think he's doing well, both because I think he really is, and also because I'm hoping as a taxpayer and a citizen of this community that he does well. We really need to have a turnaround in city government. Ed Rendell's our mayor, and we've got to all sacrifice to help him out.
The politics of organized labor. You had 4 labor leaders last night who basically said, phooey, particularly Tom Cronin in rather articulate ways. Are they posturing, or can they talk with the administration and work something out?
Well, I think they're posturing, and that's their job. They're union leaders.
But will they talk, and will they,
well,
will they work
they're going to talk.
Have to.
But you know, I mean, Ed Rendell's going to say, look, here it is. It's either going to be 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 layoffs, or we're going to all be reasonable. And I don't think that Tom Cronin or Les Yost or any of these guys are going to go back to their membership and say, we're going to lose 500 people. We've got to concede.
Okay. Neil Oxman, Shanin Specter, thanks for being with us. Our thanks also to Mark Howard. For Action News Issues and Answers, I'm Jim Gardner, and we'll see you next week at this time.
From Channel 6, the Delaware Valley's leading news station, this has been Action News, Issues and Answers.